Okay, thanks, Miguel. Um, Nancy Davidge, and as it says here on the slide, I'm the ECF, an associate program director in the Leader Resources part of the organization and editor of ECF Vital Practices. I'm also an active member of Episcopal Communicators, just finished a term as president and board member. And in my life before the church, I worked in communications for a lot of years, both in for-profit and nonprofit. And for people who know me well, probably the number one takeaway that I always like to make sure people have is to remember your audience. And we're going to be talking a lot tonight about audience, but perhaps in a slightly different way than I usually talk about it. So why don't we get started? Miguel?
Great. We always like to start with prayer or Bible study. And so I'll simply read this text, and I would encourage you to just think about what aspects of communication are included in the story. And I know Nancy will be returning to that a little later in the presentation. So a reading for Samuel. Samuel was lying down in the temple. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli, and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son, lie down again. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end, for I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, What has he told you? Do not hide it from me.
So tonight, as we talk about communications for Episcopal congregations, I want us to hold this reading in our minds. There's really 5 things that I think are quite applicable to this conversation. And the first are that the recognition that leaders are called from unlikely places. We have a boy, Samuel, perhaps he's a servant in the household. And of all the people in Eli's house, Samuel is the one that God chose. We see that the Lord is asking Samuel to deliver some bad news for him. I would expect all of us probably have sometimes, I think we like to call it sometimes triangulation, using a third person to deliver the bad message, but as communicators, that's certainly part of what we're called to do. We talk about Samuel's fear. It talks about Eli recognizing that Samuel has a message and encouraging him to not be afraid and to tell him. And the last part of this reading that's not in here, it does talk about as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. So we're going to come back to those points throughout our conversation this evening. So what are we going to be talking about for the next hour? We're going to think strategically about basic principles for creating trust. Um, Again, as I'm speaking, I ask you to reflect back on your experiences and think about opportunities when perhaps these didn't happen, and how you might want to, how it might have been different um, if there was trust. We're going to talk about communicating major decisions and changes. You know, looking at the chat, people are talking about being with small churches, being with challenged churches. So paying attention to how do we effectively communicate these hard messages. And lastly, we're going to touch on how we build engagement within and beyond our congregations. As we go along, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box. Brendan and Miguel will be there looking at them. They'll be fielding the questions to me either during the presentation or at the Q&A time that we have at the end. And so before we get started with the rest of the story, what I want to point out is that this particular webinar, we're really focusing on what happens before the 4 things that I usually talk about when I'm doing a communications workshop. And those, of course, are, you know, audience, who are we trying to reach and why? Message, what are we trying to communicate? What impact do we want to have? And the media plan, how are we going to do that? There's lots and lots of resources at the end of this presentation, or as Miguel said, if you look in that download files box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's an extensive list of resources that really help with each of these 4 areas. But the reason we chose to speak about what happens before these 4 is that so often we're dealing with miscommunication. And there's certain things that if you pay attention to them before you get to the what you're going to say and who you say it to, it really can help to minimize the kind of miscommunications that I think frustrate all of us. So to get started, I'm going to ask you all to take part in a little poll. So Miguel, if you'll put the poll up. And imagine that you helped write a grant for your church, and you're waiting to hear the result. And maybe you're coming out of the grocery store, and you run into your neighbor, and the neighbor says, wow, I'm really thrilled that that grant you were working on was given to the church. Congratulations. Tell me what your gut reaction is. Are you happy the grant was approved? I didn't hear the news first, or a little bit of both? And it looks like we've got almost everybody in there. And I think, can everyone see the results? Miguel, well, everyone can, right? They see what I'm seeing. And so you look and you see that I'm not surprised that the majority of us have some kind of mixed feeling about this. When I was testing this with a friend of mine the other day, she said, I'd be really ticked off. And I asked you this question because I think it's important that whenever we're thinking about communication, we stop and think about how what we're doing, and it could be the message, it could be the timing, it could be who we choose to tell it to, how it makes someone feel. And those feelings so often have an impact on what happens next. So I have 2 tips to offer. They sound easy. They're not. But if we can all train ourselves to do two things when we're thinking about messages. One is forget everything you know and think like your audience. And when you're thinking like your audience, visualize two people. One is your toughest critic. I mean, we all have people that we deal with who, if we say it's raining, no, it's sunny. So think how your message might impact that person. And then also think about yourself, how you respond sometimes to different messaging from other people, perhaps even other people in your congregation. And remember that, because I think when we channel that, it really helps us with our planning for more effective communications. So the first thing I want to spend a little time on is this whole idea of creating trust. And again, we remember from the Bible study that God obviously saw something in Samuel that made him trust that Samuel would be an effective messenger. Mary McGregor, who is a congregational development specialist in the Diocese of Texas, has provided some wonderful resources on ECF vital practices. But I really wanted to lift up this line from a blog post that she wrote, that as church leaders, we have a responsibility to model Christ-like behaviors, and when we don't, we pay a heavy price. You know, I hear people talk about parking lot conversations. Is that something that sounds familiar to people? When you have your meeting, but then the real vestry meeting or committee meeting happens out in the parking lot when people say all those things that, for whatever reason, they didn't feel comfortable saying at the meeting itself. So one of the things I think is important is, how do we create a safe environment within our congregations, within our vestry, within our committee, within a staff meeting? I saw, some people here were parish secretaries or assistants to the rector in a one-on-one meeting with your boss. How do we create an environment that recognizes that there are power differences? And how do we make it safe for someone to be honest, appropriately honest, kindly honest, without having some sort of backlash or punishment? How can we practice saying things using what are called I statements? I feel, I believe, in my experience, I found, versus what's often known as shaming or blaming or assigning feelings to someone else. So those are some of the things that help to create a safe environment. There's a resource at the end on creating covenants, where groups, vestries often will write out norms. We do have a feature here. It's called Raise Your Hand. If you go on the top with a little person that has their hand up, do any of you have covenants in your vestries or in your committee? And if so, would you use the Raise the Hand feature?
And for
Miguel?
those, yeah, if you can, the raise the hand feature is just above where the green arrow is right now, and I'm kind of jiggling it around there. So.
Yeah, he's. If you don't, I encourage you to look at the articles and consider setting up some covenants. Thinking about power and control is important. Power is not only just by position power, who's the boss, who's the person who's ordained, who's the person who's paid versus a volunteer. It also can be who's the person that has the information. And asking yourself and thinking, well, could that information be shared more broadly? Guarding against defensiveness. So often when someone asks a question, sometimes our natural reaction is to get defensive. And then that sets up a dynamic that really can prevent authentic conversation about some differences, perhaps, of opinion or thinking. Transparency is another area that it's really important for us to practice, to also become comfortable with. With social media, it's funny. When I did these workshops, I used to say, never put anything in writing that you wouldn't want to see on the front of the Boston Globe. I live in eastern Massachusetts. Now I say, never put anything in writing that you wouldn't want to see on Facebook and have it go around the world in seconds. So my point here is thinking about things that we may hope to or want to keep quiet. Sometimes we can't. And so really looking at what can we share with others, and what are things that if they did get out that we don't want to have get out, what's our plan for that? So transparency is a really important issue for church leaders to think about. I'm going down to my notes for a minute. They're really tiny here, so let me just, and I guess the best example I can give for that, I'm going to go back to my days when I worked in healthcare. And we had a situation, we owned nursing homes, and one day we had a report. I found out about it because the Boston Globe called me, that a staff member had behaved inappropriately with a patient. And when in good communication practice, I said, well, let me call you right back. And I went, got some information, talked to the president of the company, who, of course, did not want to talk to the Boston Globe at all. Oh, no, we can't. And I counseled a different approach. What we knew was that when this event took place, another staff member saw it, stopped it, reported it to the administrator. The administrator reported it to the authorities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the nursing home did everything they were supposed to do. And that's really a story you want to get out there. So long story short, I was able to talk to the reporter and shift the focus of the story from, no comment, how does that make a reader feel when you see that, versus reading another staff member came upon it, it was stopped, it was immediately reported, the person who did this terrible act was immediately arrested, it was reported to the state, so that you see there's a whole difference in how the people who are hearing this story feel about the whole situation. And as we want to perhaps hold things close or things, it may not be in our best interest. And I know that for many congregations, this is really challenging because the natural tendency is to, let's just hold it close and hope that it doesn't get out, which goes back to the last one, which is telling the truth. Creating trust, providing an environment where congregational leaders can have open and honest conversations, where issues of power and control are named. All of these things are critical to really effective communications. So, as I started, we talked about communications is about feelings as well as messaging. So as you're thinking about what it is that you're going to be talking about, say it's, as a vestry, you've looked at a program that the congregation has run for years. I'm thinking of a congregation in San Francisco that for many years had a daycare program. And it started out serving the children in the neighborhood who were mostly low income, didn't have a lot of options. And over time, it became more and more of a private daycare for people who had lots of other choices. And the people in the neighborhood were, I'm not sure whether they were priced out, probably not, but they probably were bumped out by others who had taken all the slots. And when the vestry looked at this and looked at what their mission was in terms of reaching out and being a part of the neighborhood and helping to lift up the people living in the neighborhood, they found that this beloved preschool really was not furthering the mission anymore. It was providing a lovely preschool. And so they made the decision to close it. And that was a really hard decision to make. And should you be in that situation, what I would counsel is that you really do some trial runs in your head or with a trusted group and ask yourself, why should anybody care about this? Who cares about this? And what's the reaction going to be when we say, in this case, we're going to close the preschool? And play out those scenarios, which then also allows you to modify, to perhaps decide to invite different people in. And actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So let me just stop for a minute and go back a little bit to the reaction. Part of what the trial run is also about is paying attention to things like tone and delivery method, your timing. Again, how would this be received? We all know that we all have the best intent when we craft our messages and we think we're being sensitive and we wordsmith the words to make sure that, gosh, we're not offending anybody, we're using all the right buzzwords in here. And yet, the impact of our words might be very, very different. And probably the most startling, catch your attention example of impact I can think of relates to Columbus Day, which of course was yesterday. And depending on who you are, you probably have some very different feelings about Columbus Day. If you think back to 1492, and if you were Spanish, you probably have one, this is a really good thing, we've discovered this new world, yay. If you were the people who were living on Hispaniola and you greeted these visitors, and then a few days, months, years later, you probably have a really different sense that this is not a good thing for us. And while I know that's an extreme example, it's really, really important to recognize that people come at things from very, very different contexts. And to take the time ahead of time, and again, before you start crafting your message, before you start thinking about, are we going to put it on Twitter, are we going to put it in the parish newsletter, are we going to put it on the website, is to really think about how is this going to make people feel? What's the reaction?
Nancy?
Yes.
So there's a very interesting conversation happening on in chat, which I'll attempt.
Yeah.
I'll attempt to summarize and describe some of the questions. I think overall, it's a conversation about the connection between leadership styles and the way in which we communicate, or which congregations communicate. And as Suze Kate even mentions at kind of just an observation, it sounds like some sort of discussion about communication should be part of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
But some of the questions include things like, how do I gauge what I might see as a minor decision, others might consider it major. Perspective is accurate, and how do we determine minor, major? To my mind, that's also a leadership question there. People note, it's often, how do we craft messages when it's also impossible to control others' reactions? And then we also had an example. What I thought was really, really interesting is that there's a congregation that's in transition from what sounds like a period of pretty poor leadership and poor communication, and is now doing regular state of the church addresses. How way of building up some trust and transparency within the community. So I just wanted to let you know that conversation is happening kind of as you're presenting.
Yeah, no, and that's really all great. I think often inviting more people into the process, testing messages, are all ways to help gauge what people's reactions are going to be. And I think the more, so many congregations do use state of the church, or efforts to involve as many people as possible in conversations. All of that is really, really good. And we're going to touch on a little bit of that as we get into the next section, which is really communicating difficult messages and change. But as you'll see, everything really is kind of all mixed up together here. All of this paying attention to context, to thinking about how the message is going to be received as a way to help it be better received. We've talked about that people don't like to get difficult messages. People perhaps don't like change. And yet, what struck me in this passage is that I really expect Eli knew that God was displeased with him. God is, when he spoke to Samuel, he basically said, "For I have told him," that meaning Eli, "that I am about to punish his house forever." He gave Eli some warnings. And I think in our congregations, when it comes to change, many people know that something is going to happen, something is going to be changing, and they're often hungry for information and for knowing, what are you thinking about? What are we going to do? Is there a plan? So the more we can talk about this and be transparent, and some of the ways to minimize resistance, which again gets to the question that someone mentioned, how do I gauge change? How do I know whether it's major or minor? Sometimes we don't. And sometimes something that we think is minor becomes major because we haven't managed it well. And the reverse can also be true. Something that you think is going to be really major. Again, think about Eli. He was afraid. Think about Samuel. He was afraid to tell Eli, and yet Eli encouraged him to, because Eli already knew that God was unhappy with him. So the three best ways that I know to minimize resistance, one is, invite key influencers to be part of the process. And this may mean moving outside of the usual suspects when it comes to who's picked for committees, who are the natural leaders. Again, who are your biggest critics? Who are people that maybe sit in the corners and grumble? How might you reach out to people and invite them to become part of the process? It may not be being part of the committee. It might be, could I use you as a sounding board? Could I, and name that. You often seem to have some objections to different plans, and invite them to participate and sort of meet them in a way that is comfortable for them to take part. We did a story recently about two congregations that merged in Western Mass. It was called Becoming Grace. And both congregations, small, rural, knew things needed to change. St. George's knew it and started to do something about it. It took them almost 10 years, but they had lots of meetings, the vestry, committees, whole church meetings, and as a group discerned that not only did they need to change, but over time they learned enough about themselves to have a good sense of what would work for them, and in the end reached out to another congregation and said, your mission and vision is very similar to ours. Can we talk about merging? The second church, St. James, it took the wall of the church to actually fall down for them to recognize that, yeah, I guess we've got to do something. And what they did, they invited and encouraged people to be part of the process. They heard there were sort of three alternatives that seemed to have some energy, and so they invited the people who had energy around each of the three to join the respective committees, to investigate, to report back to the congregation during worship services on Sundays. They had some of the time where they would give these committee reports. They voted, and it was very much an inclusive process. And there was a lot of bad news in terms of dealing with insurance, and just imagine if a wall fell in your church, all of the things. But they did a wonderful job of keeping people informed, and particularly this last one helped people understand why. As they explored the different options that were available to them, they provided context. So, there was a option of having another group buy the church, turn it into a community center, lease some of it back to the church. And there was some good back and forth about why that option, again, might not be as congruent as one of the other options with the mission and vision of that congregation. I think it took them 2.5 years to sort this all out, but what it did was, by using these key steps, it brought people along in the process. And now St. James, St. George, they've become Grace Episcopal, and they meet in a restaurant, a function room, but everyone involved was very much part of this change process. So again, the takeaway is listening, being open to hearing, and really inviting people in. So we've sort of already done kind of the check-in, I think, Miguel, but anything else, any other burning issues or things that we should touch on?
Well, the conversation continues. I think there's a very good question about, what is, if we could explore lay members' role in the work of communications. I think obviously that differs probably from place to place, depending on the size and of congregations. And just noticing that also in the chat box, seems there's a lot of folks coming from rather small congregations who may not have lots of staff.
Great. Okay. Well, and actually that the role of the lay member, talking about relationships, really can fold in rather nicely into this next section, which is talking about building relationships. And I have another quick poll. Pretty easy. Which would you rather read, a story or a report? Oh my goodness. So here's my question back to all of you. Why are your websites, newsletters, almost everything except for Facebook pages full of reports that I think one of the things that I'd like us to think about, and as we think about our communications, are how really are we sharing what it is that we as churches value. We've talked about paying attention to how people feel. We've talked about context. We've talked about being transparent. And, with all of that, I think it's important in our churches that we have strong leadership teams that are made up of both lay members, clergy members, staff for the congregations that are fortunate enough to have staff, and the many volunteers, to really work together to share our stories and our messages in the places where people are likely to learn about your church. And, I think this list here probably isn't surprising to any of you. We learn from our friends and neighbors. There's free listings, your own website, social and traditional media. And again, thinking back to the poll, I visit so many congregational websites, and I just don't see stories. And so part of what I'm trying to learn how to do better, and I would encourage all of you to please reach out to me and help me with this, is how can we help each other to be better at sharing our stories? We all remember the Bible passage about hiding our light under a bushel basket. And that's really what we're doing as people every day are doing amazing things, having amazing interactions with each other, encounters with Jesus or with God. And when we go to our sites, it's as if someone has told us, just put facts. Tell us when and where, which is important. And I think that, your service times have to be there. A directory listing, how to reach a person, that's really important. But what I'm not seeing and what I'd love to see on the pages where some of the congregations call them outreach or ministries, I'd love to hear a story about something that happened when you did your giving tree at Christmas. Where's that touching story of, the child who saved their allowance, or, for their birthday party, instead of getting presents from their friends, asked everyone to bring a gift that then they could put underneath the giving tree at church. In all of our vestry paper stories, and hopefully you're familiar with some of them, there's amazing, amazing things happening out there. And yet, even those wonderful stories are not reflected on the websites. And so I would encourage all of you, as you go back to your vestries or your meeting with the priest or the other leaders, is to really perhaps brainstorm and think about how might we start to share our stories. I expect many of you have smartphones, or if you don't, your kids do, with video cameras. Miguel, Brendan, and I are all learning how to do videos, and you're going to start to see some of our efforts on ECF vital practices. But can we videotape each other? I encourage all of you to visit the Diocese of West Texas website, and I apologize because that's not on the resource list yet. But they have some amazing videos that tell the story. You may be familiar with them if you saw the Acolyte video that was done by Acolytes last year. It was all over the web. It was really funny. But they've also done them on congregations that have these amazing ministries, and they tell the story. And I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to start to wrap this up so we have time for questions. I feel like, wow, my goodness, there's so much we could talk about. It's frustrating that we're a large group, so we can't really talk. I'd love to have time with all of you to just this stuff. But what I'd like to leave you with is that if our goal in communications really is to build relationships, that it is important that we pay attention to those things behind our message, the impact, how they make people feel. Are we saying what we want to say in the way we really want to say it? And recognizing that as we welcome others in, as participants, as members, as leaders, we have to also remember that this is going to bring change. And change is good. Again, we think about Jesus, who invited the fishermen to come along as disciples. They didn't always agree, but together they were able to do things, and they were changed, and they changed others. So as communicators, and I believe everyone is a communicator, so whether you're the communications director in your parish, whether you're the warden, the priest, parish secretary, or administrator, we all have a role to play in communications. And I think the 3 points I'd love to leave you with are being open to doing things differently, to really think about sharing power and control. And what falls out of, I think, both of those is sharing information more widely. And so now I'd like to open it up for questions. Miguel, what are you seeing?
So there's a really, I think we're hitting the crux of an issue in the chat box, which again I would describe as a question of capacity.
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples that, and I think it's just shared across the Episcopal Church in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
is, I'm one person. How do I keep up the newsletter, the Facebook page,
Mm-hmm.
write the sermon if they're clergy, all these things. So I guess one question that I would have back to the wider group, and also, of course, to you, Nancy, but also to everyone, is how do you as leaders raise up volunteers? How do you as leaders find and increase your capacity by empowering others to take on roles? Joe Toma, a little earlier on, I think it's in the chat, just talked about really identifying someone, I think it was a layperson, to take on the role of a Facebook administrator.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all seen instances in which that's done well and instances in which it's not done quite as well. So I think this is a chance, since we're all here, to just share in the chat some of how you do that. And then, Nancy, I don't know if you have an additional comment on that topic.
One of the things that I've learned as I work with people who write the Vestry Papers articles is, because often what they're writing about is somewhat factual. But I always ask someone to think about starting whatever they're writing with a description or a short story. So, something to consider is that if a group is writing a report about something that's happened, to invite them and maybe explore with them a little bit about how they might start that with a story. And of course, I'm not having an example pop right out of my head. If you were thinking about, say you were going to write about your pet blessing that many of the churches just had. One congregation that I'm familiar with, the priest shared that when they were doing the pet blessing, she was amazed at the individuals who came up to them, and they actually did it in a street fair rather than a church, with individuals who came up to them, didn't know anyone at St. Albans, I think it is, and they asked for personal blessings. And so, if you were writing your report about what happened with the pet blessings, maybe sharing that little vignette that, in addition to the dogs and the cats and the parakeets, how moving it was when a person came and asked to be blessed. Thinking about, there's a congregation in California that refurbishes bikes for people. And, to start a story about that, an article about, the bike report, how many bikes did we refurbish this year? That if you started with the joy that was on this young man's face when we gave the bike to this 19-year-old who would use the bike to get to his job instead of having to walk 5 miles each day. So those are little teeny tiny short stories, but you're sharing the impact that you had on a person. It could be about how the author felt when, in the case of the priest with the pet blessing and the person, how honored and humbled she felt when this stranger came up and said, would you please bless me? So they don't necessarily have to be long, but it's just doing these little snippets that show relationship and that show values. And I think a lot of congregations do it well on Facebook. What else, Miguel?
So I think I think there's a general consensus. I mean, or there's some, not consensus, I shouldn't say. There's a rich description, I think, of the difficulty of working with volunteers and raising up volunteers. And, the ways in which different folks have done it. Some have, tried to find one person, and sometimes that doesn't work out. It sounds like folks also raise up teams, your teams, which provides a little bit more of a layer of I guess, replicability is one word. When someone bows out, as I think is inevitable when you're working with volunteers. There is a note just about social media and social media presence. I think this is reducing a lot of tips to one insight, which is I think if you can manage to do one thing consistently, it's really more the consistency that's important than that it be photos, and what you're wanting is just it to come up pretty regularly. So if that means posting one thing a day or one thing every other day, it's really more having some consistency rather than as an early stage, I think.
Right. And I would say often when I'm asked that question about what is the one thing, the one thing I really encourage congregations to do well is, and there's a link to this resource in the resource list, is to look at the free directory listings. And by that, I mean Google Places, the Episcopal Church has a Find My Church feature. There's another one called Faith Street. But if any of you have ever Googled the name of a church or a store or a business, you know that Google Places comes up. It's there. It's free. Your church is there. And the majority of businesses and organizations in this country do not take full advantage of that. But I would say if you're a small shop, I would learn about Google Places. It's not hard to learn. And put in some little stories, something about what is important to your congregation. Right now, what's there is your address. There's probably worship times, and they're probably wrong. But you really can go in, and you can add photos. You can talk about what's important to you as a congregation. And that will be out there every single day working for you. We didn't have time tonight to talk about another one of my favorite subjects, which is how do we reach the people we don't know yet. And Google Places, take a couple of hours, learn about it, think about what you might want to put on the page, post it, and then you just need to revisit it once a month, maybe once a quarter. But it's a great way to have a presence online that really can communicate the personality and the values of your congregation.
So Nancy, thank you. And I'm just aware of the time. So I think, thank you Yeah.
That'd be great. Oh, so we've got contact information here. I'm going to flip right by how to reach all three of us. We'd love to hear from all of you. And then the resources, I've given you three fairly broad resources. And then down at the bottom, you see the articles cited in the presentation. These are things that really relate to different aspects of this presentation. So we talked about covenants, the No More Parking Lot Conversations. It's a great article and a resource from the Diocese of Texas about how you can really build healthy climates of trust in your congregations. Tone matters, mismanners really are good around intent impact kinds of things. And, you know, each of these touches on something that we did touch on so briefly tonight. And hopefully you'll find that these will be helpful to you. Or, again, ECF Vital Practices, Episcopal Communicators is an organization of people who work in communications in the church. And that ranges from, you know, paid staff who that's their title. We have a number of parish administrators who so often are responsible for communications. We have rectors, we have bishops. It really is a good source for help and assistance. And then the Episcopal Church also has a public affairs toolkit that has a lot of information about different areas that the church is working on, and I think all three you should find to be very helpful.
And if I may, just one question. Michelle Pearson notes, you know, does the Episcopal Communicators have a web form? There's an email distribution list that you can be part of, and it's just kind of a, Nancy, maybe you can describe it even better. But
yeah, what they do is for Episcopal Communicators, it is a membership organization. It's $40 a year for associate or $80 for full members, but everyone gets on a listserv, and it's the kind of place where, you know, someone is working on something. Maybe you're working in Adobe InDesign, and all of a sudden something's not working right. And people go on the listserv and they say, help, I'm having a problem with, and someone is right there to help you. And then it goes all the way to the other end in terms of really thorny kind of issues to get very much soup to nuts. But it really is people helping other people at all levels of the church. And I can't say enough about the value that I think it brings to people, and especially people who are doing communications work in isolation, which is so many of us.
And I just put the link for the join page.
Oh, good. Great.
And I just want to note, before we head out, as I can see folks are heading out, in your email, you should have an email from us just asking for some feedback on this presentation. We really do listen to your feedback and try to always improve our presentations. So if you could take a moment to just let us know how we did over the next few days, and we will pay attention and improve it for next time as well. So thank you very much. I don't know, Nancy, did you have any final comments? Or?
No, I say thanks. I mean, this it's a huge topic. We barely scratched the surface. I encourage people, if you have questions, please feel free to email me. Likewise, if you have great stories in your congregation that you'd love to share, please let me know. because I'd love to know about them for ECF Vital Practices. But thank you all very much.
So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night. And Marie, there should be an email in your inbox. If not, you'll be receiving a link